So it's my honor to introduce three of our AI for Mental Health directors, Dr. Kilian Pohl, Dr. Manish Saggar, and Dr. Paik Kim. We're going to have them come up shortly. They'll be discussing their ongoing work, which includes deep learning, generative AI, and ethics of AI. Each will talk for about 12, 13 minutes, and I'll make sure of that. And then we'll leave ample opportunities at the end for question and answers. So without further delay, our first speaker is Dr. Kilian Pohl, the founder of Computational Neuroscience Laboratories, a professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences, and by courtesy in electrical engineering here at Stanford. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pohl.
Hi, everybody. I'm trying to keep it to 12 minutes, so I'm going to talk a little bit faster today than normal. And I'm going to start out with what the goal of AI for mental health is. You already heard it from Eric. Thank you so much for the introduction, to build trustworthy and ethical AI that will transform psychiatry. And the way that these models are implemented currently, or people think about it, is kind of clinically, that these tools use data that they get from patients and then guide kind of clinicians in order for improving treatment and diagnosis and treatment. And this could be really helpful in psychiatry. I'm just focusing on the example of substance use because partly my research is really aligned with that. We currently have the problem that about 28 million people in the United States are diagnosed with alcohol use disorder, but only 8% receive treatment. And so the notion is that this AI tools can really improve access and efficiency, and especially as they get more autonomous and the patient directly interacts with the AI tool and the physician is more in the background. Whatever model you are proceeding, the kind of assumption is that this kind of tool is working like an oracle. And I wanted to make you aware of the problems with that kind of notion of seeing it as an oracle. So for example, Dr. Zhao just published on how large language models cannot reliably distinguish belief from knowledge and fact. But also, if we're looking at the example of substance use, it's actually not access and efficiency is one problem that we are facing in this domain. But the bigger problem, in my personal opinion, is the success of treatment. Only 16% of those with ARD prior to the past year are abstinent. And further, that this is not just a problem of in substance use and alcohol use disorder, but kind of a problem general in psychiatry with the use of AI technologies. The simple statistics by the FDA that they give out of approved AI medical devices. So you see here, you see the kind of the hockey stick that you're expecting to see with technology that's radically changing the field or the medical field. So you see more and more tools, AI tools being approved. Just a short, just shout out how many of those tools that you see here, roughly 500, are in psychiatry. Anybody has a number quickly? Quickly, come on, any number. 200. Well, you're all wrong, it's 0. And if you look at it on this website today, you can look it up. As of today, it's still 0. And why is that? So how can AI radically improve psychiatry? Well, for that, I'm putting on now my engineering hat. Because if you're thinking of how these tools are created by these AI engineers, they have a cost function or a benchmark or an objective that really tells them, is the tool doing better or not? Okay. And so one of those would be naturally DSM-5, right? But we know that the inter-rater variability or the inter-rater agreement of DSM-5 is for certain diseases quite low. And so the problem in psychiatry specifically, it's based on subjective assessment largely. Okay. So, why did you disappear? So we have a little problem, technical problem. Can somebody get Eric for? There we go. So it just didn't like that slide. So I'm So what I'm proposing is that we need a different way of thinking of how to develop or apply this technology, and that we use AI technology to generate findings that inform scientists, psychiatrists, clinicians that can improve their understanding of the disease so that they can come up with better objective criteria for success that increase objectivity, that then allow us to generate new AI tools and keep on focusing on this loop. And that's what I'm going to talk about. The rest of the talk is about each of these components, about findings. We now have a unique opportunity in psychiatry to publish AI-based findings in high-impact journal. That wasn't always the case. I myself started in 2006 was my first publication that used, where my collaborator used at that time an AI-based automatic segmenter to replace manual segmentation, and have continuously since then worked and with my collaborators on publishing AI-based findings in journals related to psychiatry. The other opportunity that we have currently is to increase the objectivity, as we have now access to wearable biosensors that allow us to replace essentially self-reports with kind of, for example, here, continuous measures of blood alcohol levels. So they give us criteria, objective criteria. Are we doing really better or not? The remainder, I'm going to talk about this dance between AI engineers and scientists. If you look at those communities, they actually make quite different assumptions. And so one of the challenges or charges is for those communities to closely work together so that their assumptions more better overlap with each other. Just to give you an example, if you look at psychiatry studies in general, they are mostly based on carefully recruited and small data sets. And as I pointed out, ground truth is not really clear, where AI requires large, diverse, and precisely labeled data sets. And the NIH has acknowledged this kind of gap, and therefore is funding large studies, which some of which I'm also part of. But if you look at these large studies, and if you look at ones that use MRIs, for example, those studies, I have bad news, they're actually still quite small, okay? Because if you look at an MRI, just very naively, it has like, 100 million, greater than 100 million measurements, but if you put all the public data sets together, you get something around 100,000 samples. And in AI, we are used to seeing it the other way around. Furthermore, complicating the story is that you're looking for subtle disease effects. If the disease effects, like in other fields, if the disease is already clear, it's visible, you wouldn't need all of this technology. So in general, it's quite small. So the idea is, if it's quite small, why don't we synthetically generate MRIs? And so what I'm presenting now is technology that we developed together with Wei Peng, who was a research scientist in our group, but since then moved on to a startup and is probably now a millionaire. Who knows? But all the kudos goes to him, essentially. And before I do that, I want to make sure that we are all using the same terminology. And so I'm going to do an AI language course very briefly. So generative AI, you're probably very familiar with, because you might use large language models such as ChatGPT, which produce, for example, text. And so now we are trying to produce images, or specifically brain MRIs in general, but generative AI are part of kind of algorithms that fit into deep learning, which is part of machine learning, which is part of AI. So my 30-second vocabulary course, okay? So here is an example of how you can produce synthetic MRIs from noise, okay? And you don't do this just in 2D. No, you do this actually in 3D. So here's the question for you. Which one of those two MRIs is real and synthetic, okay? Everybody has looked at it. Which one is real, which one is synthetic? Here's the answer. So if you pick the left side, you were correct. And this is the previous version. There's still some, if you closely look, I could identify here some artifacts that I wouldn't be so happy about it. But the generation that we are actually putting out now, experts can't really distinguish anymore between synthetic and real. Oh, yes, and there's the next problem. But they're coming back. Thank you so much for pointing that out. Of course, I can show you we are much better than everybody else in the field. We believe this already, right? So what can we do now with this kind of technology, right? One of the things that we can do is here was a problem that we're trying to address where we took the brain MRI and we wanted to estimate directly from the MRI the so-called brain age, okay? And if you use like your favorite deep learning tool, it just, it didn't work well because in part, some of the cohort was fairly small. For example, we had 37 people with HIV. So when we did it, just on the raw data and just with the original data, there was no great correlation between chronological and predicted age. And furthermore, we would expect that the two cognitive impaired group, MCI in hand, they would have basically accelerated aging, where our analysis showed that it's the opposite. And this didn't make any sense. So we added 5,000 synthetic MRIs to the training data set, okay? And then repeated the test, repeated the analysis on the test set. And now we get a much better correlation and we also see the effect that we wanted to see, where we have the two cognitive impaired cohorts have an accelerated brain aging. We can also use it to simulate how a brain ages, basically. So here's the example of the real MRI up here, starting at age 13, and then at 17, right? And then we can visualize that change or can simulate that change. I'm sorry. I have about 2 minutes, so that's why I'm going very fast. I'll be done by 2 minutes. And we can then show that we are, of course, doing much better than other people, but we can also apply it actually to cohorts and data sets that we haven't seen before, such as here at the HIV data set. Most exciting for me is in my last 2 minutes that I have, or 1.5 minutes, we can actually replicate disease effects that are very subtle. They're so subtle, okay, that you can't see them in an individual. So if I'm giving you a brain of somebody with alcohol use disorder versus not, versus a control, you wouldn't be able to identify the one with alcohol use disorder. And so what we did here in this experiment, we turned the brain of an MRI of a control into one that had alcohol use disorder, and vice versa. One with alcohol use disorder made it look like one with brain MRI. And those changes are very subtle. I'm trying to overrepresent them by changing, like some areas of the cortex are essentially changed, and we are able to replicate the effect of like 5 of 6 cortical lobes being different between those two cohorts. So this is generative AI, but I think basically this whole technology, generative AI is just the tip of the iceberg. What's going to be even more important for psychiatry is predictive AI. Where I can forecast essentially how individuals, if they continue with their behavior, how their risk for depression or other diseases, how it's going to develop. And so here we have an example of a study where we collected data of Nolo drinking high school students and then predicted based on sex and kind of their post-high school career if they became heavy drinker or not. And the central message was that the effect that it changed greatly. Maybe you can get Eric to the other Eric. That it changed based on, it's cutting in and out, but let's see next time. That those risk factors differ based on those factors. So at the end, I wanted to just go over the mission of the Computational Neuroscience Lab, which is to advance computational neuroscience in identifying biomedical phenotypes using creating this kind of technology. There are many organizations to thank for funding this research, and part of also of my collaborators. And all of this wouldn't be possible without those people, and that's all the thanks goes to them.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. Thank you, Kilian, for the fantastic talk. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I'll talk about how we are using some AI, not all AI, but some AI, mostly using eye, to look at how we can improve the psychiatric pathology, which basically means how we are improving or trying to improve the psychiatric diagnostic framework. That's a fancy name for framework in pathology. So typically, in traditional sense, the DSM-based diagnostic framework works something like this: there are certain clinical observations from which you derive certain symptoms, symptom markers, and based on the series of symptoms, you either label somebody with disorder A or B or C. And it's pretty standard. That's what Kilian was saying. Even right now, most of the clinical work is using this kind of symptom-based checklist to help people out. But for a long time, I think around 2010 or 2013, maybe 12 years ago, NIH came up with this idea that rather than just picking symptoms, what if we try to figure out what are the neural mechanisms underlying these symptoms? We will solve everything but display. I think one day we will solve everything. So how can we? Maybe we should focus there. But how can we figure out the neural mechanisms underneath these symptoms so that we can better target, better create treatment to target these particular disorders, which is a fantastic thing. But most of the RDoC-based RDoC stands for research domain criteria, which is essentially a dimensional-based approach. So rather than looking at ADHD versus the depression, you want to look at how executive functioning or how the attention ability is different between two groups. So rather than just labeling them in one thing, you have entire dimensions, which is great, fantastic. And what we pushed for in the RDoC domain is that can we put neuroimaging and computational modeling at the center of it? So rather than just looking at the symptoms, can you actually put in the fMRI data or other neuroimaging measures so that we can get a better handle from the circuit perspective? And the second part is, which will be the second part of my talk, which is not all kinds of neuroimaging is great, but at the end of it, it's still descriptive. It tells you what is different. It doesn't tell you how that change manifests. And that's where the mechanistic modeling comes in. So we use analytical systems to try to simulate data, simulate these things, and then we tweak these models and say, if I change the inhibition excitation one way, does that change the outcome? And does that then match the disorder we're looking at? And that allows us to go back and to go back to the mechanisms, how and why things are different, not just they are different. So we started with putting brain in RDoC. This is work by Sean Kwa, my postdoc. It's a joint work with several people at Stanford as well, where we tried to differentiate, the mouse part is not working, but try to differentiate between expert-defined RDoC framework, which is like, hey, put things into dimensions. By the way, the entire RDoC framework was made by a bunch of fantastic experts who sat down in different rooms and decided this is how it should be. So they never actually went to the data and tested it and validated it. So one of the first things we did is, let's take a look at the data. Let's just see the dimensions they came up with are actually truly independent in some way, or can we come up with better dimensions? That was the first project where we used fMRI task contrast to see how RDoC, the expert-driven model, fits the real data. Turns out it doesn't do a good job. And so just to give an example, the top half of this figure is these different dimensions that RDoC came up with, and turns out they don't fit the data as well, but the picture is much more complex. There is so much intertwining between different factors and sub-factors that it's not really as simple as we thought. And that was our first forte into the space to show that expert-driven models need refinement based on data. And we tested it on different data sets to show that it's truly the case. But let me now take you to the next step, which is even if, let's say, we take all kinds of neuroimaging data across people and come up with the best method. Well, before I go there, sorry, I was jumping myself ahead. But if to fully test these kind of frameworks, these kind of dimensional frameworks, we use a large chunk of data, about 6,000 participants who did like 47 different task contrasts. But if you have to go further to really test the entire, all the dimensions of the cognitive framework, you need a lot of tasks per person. And this is where deep learning comes in. So I had to put deep learning somewhere in the talk. So this is where it's coming in. So if you are trying to refine a system which has a lot of cognitive and social and other dimensions, you need a lot of tasks per person so that you can then say, okay, so if I look at all these circuits that are being lit up in a particular person with different tasks, then I can say, do they fit into the expert-driven framework, or do they need a special data-driven framework, then ultimately link them to the symptoms, but it's not scalable. I mean, how many of you would sit in the scanner and go through 100 different tasks if I asked you to? I highly doubt many people will. And that's where deep learning comes in. So what we are trying to do is we take the resting state data. So resting state is very, very well known these days task of data collection, style data collection from fMRI, where you just lie inside the scanner and let your mind wander, think about funding and all kind of fun stuff. And then we take that brain data. And the idea is I can, from using deep learning, construct a brain map of how your brain would look like if you were doing a different kind of task. Could be a social task, could be a working memory task, all kinds of tasks. And the hope is by doing that, we don't need you to do 100 tasks. Just from resting state alone, we can derive all the tasks and do. From that, we can just refine the diagnostic framework. So previously, people have done that. Kudos goes to these people in my lab, Soren and Young, who basically scale the deep learning framework too. So typically, people use convolution nets to do it, very expensive in terms of parameter training. And they made a graph convolution net, which apparently can do the job better and much more efficient. So I can go into detail of the model if you get interested, but bottom line is that we are better at predicting tasks. This is just showing one single subject. This was the task. This was the brain map, threshold at different thresholds at a single, for one task at different thresholds for a single person. And then we basically showed that our deep learning models can predict how the brain would look like when you do the task much better. So yellow is the overlap. So overlap is higher. So we can essentially predict which circuit you would engage in when you do a particular task much better than sometimes even the repeat task. Meaning if you come back into the same task again, deep learning can predict better than even your own repeat task, which is fantastic. And as I said, graph convolution is perfect. It can do this training and learning much faster, but much fewer parameters, which is great. But then I'm coming to the second part. I don't know how much time I've taken, but the second part is great, but even these neuroimaging contrasts are still descriptive. They're only telling you about what is different. They're still not going into the mechanistic side of things. And that's where we use dynamical systems. So the idea on this busy, and again, we're not the first one. Many people have tried this, where we take structural data, meaning the DTI or structural connectome of how different regions of the brain are literally, it's like the plumbing of the brain, how different regions of the brain are structurally connected to each other. And from that, we can extract, or we can use dynamical system models to simulate your brain activity, not stimulate, simulate it. And from that, we can derive many things. And so this work was led by Mungson and Yinming in my lab. Both of them are now assistant professors. And what they essentially did is they tried to model each brain region as a coupled oscillator. So this is, apologies, there's no way I can describe it in 2 minutes. But the rough idea is you have coupled oscillators, meaning you frame each brain region as a population of inhibition neurons and excitation neurons, and you let them dance with each other. You play with the parameters. So the inhibition tries to inhibit, excitation tries to excite, and then that allows you to essentially look at different dynamical properties of the whole brain dynamics, meaning you can see whether, let's say this is a rough landscape, you can see if the brain is stuck in one state, and if you push the brain one way or the other, can you have multiple states where the brain can go into, or all kinds of possible ways. And these things, by the way, are called attractors. These tiny valleys where, think of it, if your brain dynamics get stuck, are the valleys where what we call attractors. So you can imagine somebody with depression, they may have very deeper valleys, but it's very hard for them to change their brain dynamics. They get stuck in one. If you have ADHD, you might have very low valleys where you'll be jumping from one state to the next much faster. Just a very rough, nice example there. So what Mungson did, she said, rather than looking at, typically in the entire space, what people were doing was they were looking at one attractor, and they would do a noise perturbation around that attractor to figure out what's happening in the brain. Mungson said, what if we chart out all possible attractors that your brain could go to? And this is really a very drastic idea than what everybody else does, which is, given a structural connectome that you will give me, can I find out all possible brain states that the brain can ever go to, which is constrained by the physics. And once we do that, then we can not only simulate your brain better, but we can eventually, hopefully, fix psychiatry and everything else. Okay, so I'll go faster. But so first thing we show that yes, we can actually fit your brain dynamics better or functional organization better with this kind of approach where we look at all possible brain states your brain can go to that can fit the real data much better than the state of the art. Then we go into clinical data. We are, okay, 2 minutes left. We are looking at how different disorders, we should give me 20 minutes now. We can look at how different disorders are differentiating based on these model parameters. For just to give you a very rough idea, so if you look at inhibition to excitation ratio, this is the biggest result we found. That if you look at people with schizophrenia versus people who are healthy, the inhibition to excitation ratio in the brain is what was differentiating them the most. Again, this is a very blank screen, but this is a very basic principle, and we are going to move away from labels to more dimensions. And maybe I should stop. But we are also doing this this is David Emoni, who just started his faculty position in UCI with Pizzagelli. But he took this idea further. He said, okay, if you have people who go through, this is a collaboration work with Williams, where we looked at if you give people TMS-based protocol to cure depression, can these modeling parameters give you an insight into what is happening inside the brain and how the dynamics are changing? And you can read the fantastic paper, but the bottom line is, yes, we can figure out, and this is again a populated blank slide, but we can figure out how we found that people who responded to TMS treatment had dynamics which are, they basically, if you have an attractor state, they stay closer to the attractor, whereas people who had depression, they were all over the place. So we can get these kind of mechanistic insights. And why they're important? Because then you can go and develop, even in the simulation synthetic brain, you can develop treatment to see whether you can cure that thing. And then you can go to a real person and develop a treatment. So rather than just going from verbal theories to a treatment, you have a mathematical foundation to base your theories on, and then you should go and test it. So last slide, closing the loop. Yes, we want to find the underlying neural mechanism. So we are doing that by adding neuroimaging. We are finding the latent representation. And then we're doing dynamics. And eventually I'll end. Anyway, thank you so much, Ben.
All right. Yeah, so I will be talking about evaluating LLMs for mental health care. Just begin here. So there's a lot of exciting work right now that generally is concerned with trying to figure out where LLMs fit into clinical care. And they're currently being explored for a range of clinical tasks. Some of these include training therapists as one of the projects featured in Dr. Wiltsey Sturman's center grant. Another use case is supporting CBT homework. Another pilot project of mine is using it as explaining informed consent. So because these use cases are still exploratory, not yet deployed in routine care, we're still having to deal with answering the fundamental core questions of, one, whether they perform these tasks as intended, and two, how they compare to existing approaches. Spoiler alert is also that LLMs are now increasingly being used as evaluators themselves, so that kind of raises a whole set of new questions about whether evaluation can be trustworthy. Okay, so just clarify what exactly we're evaluating here. For the purpose of this talk, I'm talking about a task of an LLM. So an example would be, let's consider a task of an LLM to be to deliver CBT advice. So a patient comes to an LLM with some sort of anxiety concern, and the LLM then provides a response that should be grounded in CBT. So the evaluation of this task would look something like this. Did the LLM demonstrate a CBT skill? So this is to be differentiated from thinking of an LLM as LLM-mediated kind of therapy or an intervention on its own. I'm thinking about just at the task level more granularly. So the roles can be reversed, as in one of the projects of Shannon's grant. So the task of the LLM could be training the therapist by role-playing as a simulated patient. So the LLM here is a simulated patient that comes with a anxiety concern, and then the the therapist in training responds to that prompt with their advice. right? So again, evaluation of an LLM task here would be, did the model use an effective prompt to train the user in a specific skill? So in traditional RCT settings, right, we have a single data generating mechanism that produces evidence. We have external evaluation. We're trying to answer this question, does it work, right? In this new kind of landscape, we have LLMs, models producing outcomes alongside humans. So this kind of fundamentally shifts this evaluation process. And so the question then becomes, could we be doing this? Should we be doing this? Can we trust these ratings, LLM ratings, as kind of surrogate outcome for the human ratings? So this should be, I argue that this should be tested before we actually use this as an approach. Just to give a concrete example of what the data would look like, kind of similar setup as before, but suppose you have a set of patient prompts, and then you have responses to that prompt. So each row is a certain instance. You have a response to that patient that is LLM generated. That could also be human generated, or just a therapist. What I mean by LLM evaluations is this highlighted column is that this is a rating of the quality of the output, but that's determined by the model. And the column to the right is just the kind of human rating. So there are examples like this in the literature. I just wanted to mention one particular example that came out a month ago by Badawi and colleagues, and they've assembled a benchmark data set based on existing conversations. So these are around 10,000 conversations that were recorded and transcribed, and they sampled from that a set of conversations, which they looked at the original responses from therapists, and then they looked at model-generated responses, and they compared those two across a bunch of attributes. So empathy, safety, and knowledge. And their general finding was that there's a pretty high degree of variability in terms of agreement. There's some item categories where there's a lot of agreement, high agreement, but there's pretty low agreement in some other categories. So this is pretty strong kind of an indication that we can't yet be just relying on LLM evaluations right now. Human ratings are still essential. But the other kind of notable aspect of this is that the amount of kind of burden and cost it takes to get a data set where you're getting human ratings of 10,000 conversations, this is very, very costly. And this is a particular, I think this was based on CBT, but every other therapeutic domain would require its own data set. It's a huge problem. So this is kind of brings us to the point that I'm trying to get at, which is a need for a more efficient approach. So we have this big constraint here that the human ratings are very costly, but they're still essential. So how can we really evaluate tasks in a principled way? So I'm going to just present an approach that can help address this issue, and just go over kind of give you a sense of what it involves. So we can think of a two-step kind of sampling methodology where kind of big picture is step one, you start small and you get a small but diverse sample of, you can rate both, you have an equal set of samples of model ratings and human ratings. And then the second step is to get a subsample just for human ratings. So I'll explain why I'm breaking it down in two steps. The first step is really to start simple and intentionally small. So you have a preliminary sample where you have equal sizes of human ratings and model ratings. And the idea here is to really understand agreement, the extent of agreement. So where are there questions where there's high agreement versus low agreement? And what are the factors that are related to agreement? So this is what the Badawi paper kind of looked at, and albeit on a very large data set. But they looked and saw that there's pretty high agreement on certain question categories, such as guidance and informativeness, basically anything kind of in the cognitive domain. And as you move to the right, there's a little bit more instability, and for things like safety and relevance, there's a lot of variability and very low agreement in some cases. So this, what I propose is, I think this type of insight should be incorporated, and it should be kind of it should inform us in knowing where should we allocate our human resources, really, given that they're expensive. So the second step would be to get a subsample of human ratings. So the idea is, given what we know about agreement and alignment, where should we focus our efforts, right? So first, the idea is that you would have models rate the entire data set, because that's easy, right? The second step is that we're going to get a sampled subset. So we get a sub-cohort on this whole data set, but how are we going to sample them? It's not deterministic. We're going to get a random sample, but this random sample should depend on what we found in that first step. So areas where there's high agreement should be an indication where we don't need as much human evaluation. Areas where there are low agreement, we should probably oversample those types of cases for more human evaluation. Okay. And then finally, after all is said and done, how do we analyze the data? What would the data look like? Well, this is just a very oversimplified version of what it would look like, but you would have a portion of data that's joint ratings. And those are your collections from your stage 1 and stage 2 sampling. So the first 2 rows there, you have complete data. And then another portion of your data, you only have LLM ratings, you don't have human ratings. But this was actually planned by design. It's missing data by design. And we know the sampling probabilities because we set them ourselves. So it's a classic kind of missing data problem in which we know the sampling probabilities. We can kind of proceed with any missing data technique that we want. One way is we can use inverse probability weighting, where we use the complete cases of the humans, but we give them each a weight, and that weight is going to be inversely proportional to the probability of it's being selected for that data set. You can also use multiple imputation, or you can use a combination of both, which is doubly robust estimation, which requires that either the selection model that you use or the imputation model that you use is correctly specified. But here, by design, because we know our sampling probabilities, we set them ourselves, the selection mechanism is correctly specified. So it's guaranteed to be valid. Okay, so just in closing, I really wanted to underscore the importance of testing assumptions before we actually rely on LLM. As evaluators, we should test whether that should be done. And I just give you an idea about a 2-step sampling approach that could be just a principled way to test that assumption. And it kind of targets human effort where it's needed. It also just gives us a statistically valid way while saving human effort. So this is just one step forward for evaluation. I think this will be a challenge that will continue. So thanks for